From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Caitlin Lyons.
Kamala Harris speaks to the National Association of Black Journalists, proposing a 7% cap on child care costs, while Donald Trump pledges to revive the state and local tax deduction.
We'll have more this hour on their economic policies and tomorrow's Fed decision with Dana Peterson of the Conference Board. Plus, we'll be joined by Republican Senator Bill Hagerty of Tennessee, member of both the Banking and Foreign Relations Committees.
He'll weigh in on the looming deadline to avert a government shutdown, just 14 days off now, and the latest from the Middle East as Lebanon accuses Israel of engineering a pager attack against Hezbollah that wounded almost 3,000 people. Welcome to the Tuesday edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. A remarkable story there, Kaylee. When you read through that on the terminal, you wouldn't believe it if you saw it in a movie. But it's just one of the stories we'll be pursuing today with eyes, of course, on the campaign trail. And more talk today before the NABJ, this time Kamala Harris's turn.
Yep, sat down with a number of black journalists in Philadelphia weeks after Donald Trump had done the same at their actual NABJ conference. And that, of course, was when he questioned Kamala Harris's own racial identity. She did field some questions around race here, but also talked about specific policy.
We did get to policy, as we mentioned, that 7% cap on child care costs, which brings us back to her ideas of expanding the child tax credit. She also spoke to the matter of her own racial identity and her appeal to black voters.
I think it's very important to not operate from the assumption that black men are in anybody's pocket. Black men are like any other voting group. You got to earn their vote. So I'm working to earn the vote, not assuming I'm going to have it because I am black.
Joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson. Wendy, her comments around race and racial history in the U.S. didn't stop there. She was talking at one point about the generational impacts of slavery and redlining and Jim Crow laws and that kind of thing. But she also did speak more broadly to policy that would affect all Americans or most Americans, including this notion around child care costs for those who have children being capped at 7% of their income. This is an older idea from this administration. How would it work?
Right. Well, it is a very old idea that she's taking from Biden's Bring Back Better plan of 2021. And that was when, we were out of COVID and people were starting to go back to work and looking at the absolutely staggering cost of childcare, which for many people means the difference between working just to pay for childcare and working. So this is something that not only affects middle class and lower income people, also, all working women are concerned about the cost of childcare, and capping it at 7% is a pretty small percentage given what a lot of people pay for childcare. And it's something she'll have to get through Congress, so it'll be interesting to see how that'll all play out.
The big news from the other campaign today was SALT, which is something that we talk about a lot around here on Bloomberg. I'm assuming outside of certain states like New York and Connecticut.
Spike.
Yeah, well, that's right.
Yeah.
Not exactly a household conversation for all Americans, but Donald Trump went there. The quote is everything. I will turn it around, get SALT back, lower your taxes, and so much more. Where did this come from to begin with?
Donald Trump.
Okay.
Donald Trump. It was in his 2017 tax law. He capped the state and local income tax at $10,000, which for people in a lot of Trump country states is plenty. Yeah. For people in New York, New Jersey, California, other really high-cost states, $10,000 of property tax is barely enough.
So is he arguing with his own tax policy?
Yes, he is now going against his own tax policy, but he's been in this pattern lately where he is throwing out, it seems desperate. I don't know if he really is feeling desperate, but it certainly seems desperate. It's like IVF for everyone. I'll take back the SALT thing. I'm great for women. I'll do this. And there are just these unthought out policy proposals that aren't backed up by details. To be fair, Kamala Harris hasn't really backed up hers with a lot of details either. but he's just throwing things on the wall to see if they'll stick.
Well, and a lot of them do pertain to taxes specifically. Now the SALT cap deduction is not going to be capped anymore. No tax on Social Security, no tax on tipped income, no tax on overtime hours, lower taxes for corporations. Where is the Republican ethos of fiscal responsibility in any of these plans?
Well, exactly, because what that means is there isn't enough money to run the government. Someone was suggesting that if you took the Pentagon is obviously the biggest budget item in the United States, but you couldn't fund anything else if all of Donald Trump's tax cuts go through. And then the tariffs plan will also raise prices for consumers.
But he says that will raise revenue as well.
He says it will raise revenue as well. A lot of economists don't agree. So none of this adds up if you stop and think about it. But what he is doing is throwing red meat out there at his rallies. And our own Bloomberg News Morning Consult poll has shown we did a blind taste test of a lot of economic policies, not saying who proposed them. But if you say tax cut, 80% of swing state voters say bring it on. So it's going to be really interesting to see what will fly.
Sure, to be continued. Wendy Benjaminson, thank you. Reporting for Bloomberg. Moving to the Middle East now, an important story that we've been following with now nearly 3,000 people injured across Lebanon, following the explosion of thousands of pagers. Yes, like the old pager you used to wear in the 80s. Hezbollah has accused Israel of orchestrating the incident. Israel has not commented for what it's worth, but White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre was asked about this during the briefing today.
If you're asking me if the U.S. was involved, no, the U.S. was not involved. If you're asking me if we were aware of the operation, we were not aware of this incident, that hundreds of pagers, as you just mentioned, were going to explode in Lebanon ahead of time. This is not something that we were aware of, and I'm just not going to go beyond that.
Joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams around the table here in Washington. So, Nick, obviously the finger has been pointed at Israel. Israel has not claimed responsibility for this attack, but I would imagine this is still something that Hezbollah could retaliate against Israel for.
Yeah, I mean, I think the evidence would suggest, or at least past precedent would also suggest, that this is something that Israel would do. I mean, these were pagers that were in the hands of a whole dozens of senior commanders for Hezbollah in the south of Lebanon, in an area where Israel has essentially threatened to open a new front in a conflict we've seen in the Middle East since October 7th. So certainly in keeping with that, I also did think the language from the White House spokeswoman, Karine Jean-Pierre, there was pretty telling. It seems like whenever there is an Israeli operation that Israel doesn't claim credit for, the U.S. always says it had nothing to do with it. It just feels like this sort of language that we've now heard so many times from them. But the big question for me is, okay, what next? So does this mean that this is a precursor operation that was meant to sort of take out a whole swath of Hezbollah commanders in anticipation of an Israeli invasion? Or is this just something that's meant to hobble Hezbollah, keep them weak, keep them off balance as Israel continues the war in Gaza?
And does it draw a retaliation? We know that Israel essentially told America to step back when it comes to military activity on the northern border, telling Amos Hochstein, representing the administration, there is now only a military solution against Hezbollah. Is this the beginning of it?
Well, I mean, that's the question we're all trying to answer. I mean, what you have seen from Hezbollah so far is a series of rocket attacks of varying degrees of intensity. There is some notion or expectation that if Hezbollah really wanted a devastating attack on Israel, they could potentially do so, and they have held off from doing that so far. So big question about what Hezbollah does here, but really the focus is on Israel and what happens next and whether they are going to essentially open what would be a second front in that war. And at this point, the signs are indicating we're headed in a very, very tense direction because, as you mentioned, Amos Hochstein, the president's envoy, goes to the region, essentially gets rebuffed by Prime Minister Netanyahu, who tells him to take a hike. I mean, it's just extraordinary language between
Well, and the
allies.
Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, is now in the region again for, the 10th time since October 7th, decidedly not going to Israel, going to Egypt instead. So what does that signal?
Well, I mean, I think it says a lot of things. They are really feeling much more pessimistic about the chances of the ceasefire agreement, and there's just no indication that either side wants it. And you also have an administration that's torn between the imperative of wanting to run through the tape. This is a politically difficult issue at home. They obviously want to get this thing solved for political reasons, but also because of the devastating impact it's had in the region. But he keeps going to Israel, and Blinken keeps getting turned away. The words are nicer, the pleasantries are there, but the result is essentially the same. He doesn't want to have that again.
All right, Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams, thank you so much for joining us. And coming up, we'll continue these conversations around economics and foreign policy with Republican Senator Bill Hagerty of Tennessee, member of the Senate Banking and Foreign Relations Committees. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
The Speaker came forward with a plan to combine both the SAVE Act to make sure that U.S. elections are for U.S. citizens, to combine that with a continuing resolution to extend that into the new year where we can come back and address the reckless spending in Washington. I think that's a very reasonable and appropriate play call. Now, in a narrowly divided Congress, as we have, any vote is difficult. I hope he brings that to the floor. I think it'll pass. It'll put the Senate on the clock to both secure the election and to make sure that we have government funding in place.
That was Republican Congressman Brian Stile of Wisconsin on the early edition of Balance of Power, talking about how once the House signs off on a funding bill, if it does, it'll be up to the Senate to carry it through. Joining us now for more is a member of that body, Republican Senator Bill Hagerty of Tennessee, live here on Bloomberg TV and radio from Capitol Hill. Senator, it's great to see you this evening. Thank you for being with us. I think we both know that in a Democratic-controlled Senate, a continuing resolution with the SAVE Act attached is not going to pass. So what do you expect your body is going to send back to the House ultimately? A continuing resolution of what duration?
We're going to see what we come down to. It's so frustrating here, Kayleigh, because I'm on the Appropriations Committee. We've had our appropriation bills ready to go. Rather than deal with this, Chuck Schumer keeps bringing forward show votes. Today it was IVF vote we'd already taken 2 months earlier that had really not that much to do with IVF and a lot to do with cloning and gene editing that he knew would fail. These are just messaging votes to distract the public. We need to be doing our job. Back to the duration, it's hard to say what's going to come out next week, but we should have been focused on this weeks ago, and it really is legislative malpractice to find ourselves in this situation.
Legislative malpractice, you could apply to a lot of things that we've seen over the course of this Congress, Senator, but the conventional wisdom is that you're going to save the day, that the Senate will jam the House, as they say, and will avoid a shutdown. And the logic is everybody needs to get home, certainly on the House side, to do a little bit of campaigning. Do you see it that way, or are we at risk of sleepwalking into a shutdown?
Well, Joe, that is the conventional wisdom, that people need to get home, people need to campaign. This election could not be more critical right now, certainly at the presidential level, and I think the Senate, we've got a tremendous opportunity before us to change the gavel. It's going to require a lot of work and taking nothing for granted. We'd certainly like to get home and do that, but we need to get this done right.
Well, Senator, as we consider the campaign that will be happening, the campaigning that these members will be doing, and of course some of your colleagues as well, it is in the effort to get Republican control of both the House and the Senate, and presumably do a little something with tax policy when the 2017 tax cuts enacted during the first Trump administration expire. Donald Trump today suggested that a portion of what that bill was, which was capping the state and local tax deduction at $10,000, will be reversed if he becomes president again. What exactly is the policy going to be here on SALT?
Well, I haven't had an opportunity to discuss this directly with President Trump, but I think this was happening in the context of a huge rally that will be underway there in New York. I know it's going to be very popular in New York. Tax cuts in general in this environment, given the inflation that we've all experienced, are very appealing to the American public. One thing we've got to do, though, is address inflation head on. And President Trump has laid out an incredible plan to put us back into the business of producing energy like never before. That will have a direct and immediate impact on inflation, and everybody will feel that. He's also put forward proposals on taxes for tips, taxes on Social Security. All of these are aimed at getting the middle class into a far better position. And all of these come from a person that's actually quite credible, because under his watch, under his previous administration, we saw everyone prosper, particularly the blue-collar class prosper more than white collars in every demographic group, whether they be Hispanic, black, female, you name it. Everybody did better under President Trump on a real basis.
Well, you just mentioned a couple of the exemptions that he's proposing, and there seems to be a sea of them when we look at both campaigns, which is something we discussed with Maya McGuinness, Senator, of course, president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, who's always asking, what about the pay-fors? Here's what she said about each of the candidates' economic promises.
This is the biggest kind of Oprah Winfrey moment of economics, of free this for you, and you get this, and you get this, and you get this. And we can just see them ratcheting it up and competing on giveaways that literally are making every economist around the country kind of blanch at how the incentives are wrong, the vision is wrong. This is just not a comprehensive economic strategy.
Senator Hagerty, I don't think either of us are getting free cars today, but I do wonder if Donald Trump needs to say more than drill, baby, drill, and that will simply grow out of it when it comes to expressing the belief here that we can keep the deficit under control. It is something that some voters are worried about, even if we don't talk about it very often on the campaign.
Joe, I think the question that President Trump needs to put the American public is actually even simpler than that. He needs to ask them very simply and very straightforward, were you better off when I was president, or are you better off when Biden and Harris were in office? Kamala Harris has had over 3.5 years.
But if the deficit keeps ballooning, that means our kids might not be better off. Right, Senator?
No, you're absolutely right. We've got to bring the deficit under control. We need to get the economy growing again. We need to bring the regulatory regime back under control as well. All of these have dampening pressures on the economy. We're running massive deficits like we've never seen before. We've got to bring that in control. And the Biden administration just wants to continue to spend through the roof. We've got a spending problem, not so much a revenue problem as we do a spending problem, and that has to be held in check.
So that's the fiscal policy, Senator. We can't speak to a member of the Banking Committee without also asking you about monetary policy, given tomorrow's Fed decision. Do you see justification for a 50 basis point Fed cut?
You know, the market's got about 50-50 divided between whether it's going to be a 25 basis points cut or a 50 basis points cut. I've said all along it needs to be data-driven. I'm going to be very interested to see what Chairman Powell has to say as he makes his announcement tomorrow. One thing I'm also very interested to hear him talk about is the size of the Fed's balance sheet. We've not heard enough about that, but a $7 trillion balance sheet is inherently stimulative as well. That cuts against the rate increases that have been put in place. I know this is beyond the chairman's control, but also Treasury that continues to shorten the maturities of its bond issuances. You know, we need to talk about all of this in the context of the true desire to get the Fed's, the Fed's focus, which is bringing inflation down below its 2% target, to get that into the sights. So there's going to be a lot to listen for tomorrow with the chairman. Hard to say, but the market certainly seems to be in between a 25 or a 50 basis point cut.
Need to ask you, Senator, as well from your perch on the Foreign Relations Committee about what happened today in Lebanon. I'd love to know what you're hearing, if anything. The Department of State spokesman Matthew Miller had this to say about the possibility of escalation following this pager incident that injured thousands of people in Lebanon. Here's what he said.
Since October 7th, we have seen any number of incidents that have led to the heightened risk of escalation. We are always concerned about escalation. We are always concerned about any type of event that may cause further escalation. And it remains our message to both Israel and to other parties that they need to do everything they can to try and reach a diplomatic resolution.
Senator, I didn't allow too much time for us. We only have about a minute left, but I wonder if you believe this is something that Israel was responsible for. What will be the retaliation?
Well, it certainly amazes me that our State Department spokesman will only name Israel and says other parties. They won't talk about the fact that Iran is behind all of this. He didn't mention Hezbollah that's basically displaced 50,000 Israelis right now in northern Israel. This is in retaliation for actions that have been taken by Hezbollah. If indeed it's Israel that's behind it. And I think what it does demonstrate is the resourcefulness of whoever put this in place, because they've been able to get into the supply chain and get directly into the minds, I think, of the people that are there. This should have an incredible deterrent effect if indeed Israel is behind it.
Are you going to be the Secretary of State or Secretary of Treasury if Donald Trump is president again?
Joe, the most important thing right now is to win the election in November and not create any sort of speculative sideshows on the side. So you won't get me engaging in who might be where after November. You've got me focused right now on what we've got to do here in the Senate and what we need to do to win the White House and the House. Thanks.
You know, I had to try, Senator. We don't have Bill Hagerty here every day. The Republican Senator of Tennessee, it's good to see you.
Kayleigh.
Thanks for being with us on Bloomberg. Coming up, a conversation with the Iraqi Prime Minister exclusively on Bloomberg. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thanks for joining us. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines in Washington. In an exclusive interview with Bloomberg, Iraq's prime minister says it is time for the approximately 2,500 American troops to depart now that ISIS is mostly defeated. Here's part of that interview.
Today, Iraq in 2024 is not the same as Iraq of 2014. We have defeated Daesh with our sacrifices and the Iraqi people's position from all of its components and factions, and with the support of the international community and friends, and we do appreciate that. We found that the justifications ended, and there is no longer a need for a coalition of 86 countries. We moved from a period of wars to a period of stability. Daesh doesn't pose a threat to the state. It may be part of the security challenges like drug trade and criminal offenses. It's at that level. It's not equal to Daesh now. A group of terrified people hiding in caves, in the desert, in the mountains, and a real threat to security and stability. Based on this vision and evaluation, we initiated a conversation with our friends in the international coalition, and it was honest and included more discussions on various levels, and was culminated with my visit to Washington, D.C., and talking to President Biden. We formed a joint committee in August of 2023 between military commanders to start the conversation, and, in fact, the committee reached an understanding to arrange for that withdrawal.
That was part of Bloomberg's interview with Iraqi Prime Minister Mohammed Shia Al-Sudani. You can find the full interview online or on the terminal. And we would point out to our Bloomberg TV and radio audiences that just this afternoon, Pentagon spokesman Pat Ryder was actually asked about this and told reporters that there is no timeline yet for a U.S. withdrawal from Iraq. Joe, obviously, a response to what we've heard from the Iraqi Prime Minister.
No, you know you're onto something when you get a response like that from the U.S. government, and you wonder as well to what extent this might be something that Joe Biden deals with as president before he leaves the White House. Yeah. We'll, of course, let our audience know if there's any further developments on that.
Indeed, we will. In the meantime, we're looking ahead to tomorrow's Fed decision. We'll have more on that next with Dana Peterson, Chief Economist of the Conference Board. That's here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
If they don't do 50 tomorrow, I'll be shocked. So they do 25 or 50. If they do 25, they'll lather it on pretty quick that they're going to do more later.
I think we'll actually know in less than 24 hours. That was Ed Hyman, founder chair of Evercore ISI, speaking on Bloomberg earlier today ahead of, yes, the Fed's rate decision at last tomorrow. I spoke earlier today with Danny Blanchflower, the professor of economics at Dartmouth College, who shared his own thoughts on what he thinks the Fed will do.
Consensus is gradually moving towards 50. But I think really the big issue is what's the signal going forward? What do the dot plots look like? And are the markets right to be basically pricing in not just rate cuts now, but rate cuts going forward? My bet, if I had to really bet, was they'll go with 50.
Joining us now for her take and a closer look at this Fed meeting, Dana Peterson, Chief Economist at the Conference Board. Dana, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. It's good to see you. I believe you're looking for 25 basis points if we can get right to this. If that's the case, is it because the Fed doesn't want to spook the market, to think that things might be worse than initially believed, or to not be perceived as political?
I don't think it's a political element. The Fed is independent. It's going to pursue monetary policy independent of what's happening in Washington and certainly with the elections. In terms of going 25 versus 50, I do agree that 25 would be about right. I think certainly when we look at the labor market, it's in better balance. Inflation is heading back to the 2% target over time. And also the labor market is doing relatively well, even though it's certainly not as strong as it was post-pandemic. Yeah. But I think that anything more than 25 basis points would spook markets and indicate that the Fed is more worried about the economy.
Okay.
Well, so if you don't necessarily see reason for that material worry at this point when you're looking at the labor market, knowing that the tight policy we already are living with is still, the lag effects may still be kicking in, and we're just starting to see it really affecting the labor market. If they decide not to go big up front, knowing their next decision isn't until November, could it be too late then for a larger cut to actually avert something bad happening in the labor market if we see a serious disintegration between September and October?
Well, back to the labor market, I think that it's slowing because you don't need to run the faucet as hard to fill up the tub. I think we're at full employment, and so you don't need outsized gains in payrolls. But certainly if the Fed does sense that there's something worse with the economy, that consumer spending is going to slow dramatically, and or, yes, we do see material weakening in the labor market, then the Fed has plenty of room to go ahead and amp up the size of its cuts per meeting.
With all of that said, we've been asking a lot of economists about where the economy will be when the next president takes office, whether it's Donald Trump or Kamala Harris. Considering the fact that we are entering a new regime now, what will this look like or feel like in January?
Well, our view is that the second half of this year will see slower GDP growth. Yes, as we're seeing ongoing effects and probably the full effects of tight monetary policy on business investment and consumer spending. And let's not forget, consumers are also levering up and need to repair their balance sheets. But we think that starting early next year, the economy will pick up. We'll see stronger growth as the Fed cuts interest rates. Businesses will get back out there and invest. Consumers who are looking to buy a home will see lower mortgage rates. So we think that we will continue to see some improvement in the first half of next year, and then very strong improvement in the economy in the latter half of next year.
Well, of course, the economy could also be impacted by the policies the next president will pursue when they take office in 2025. And Kamala Harris gave a little taste of further policies she would like to see when she spoke earlier today at the National Association of Black Journalists, talking about a cap on child care costs. This is what she said.
My plan is that no family, no working family should pay more than 7% of their income in child care. Because I know that when you talk about the return on that investment, allowing people to work, allowing people to pursue their dreams in terms of how they want to work, where they want to work, benefits us all. It strengthens the entire economy.
So, Dana, obviously there is a question as to how this policy would actually be implemented, if it could even get through Congress. But when she speaks about the economic effects it could have, what would that do to female labor force participation, for example?
Certainly, female labor force participation in the United States is very low compared to other economies, even Canada, our northern neighbor. And certainly, we're looking at labor shortages across a number of industries. So one way to address labor shortages is to have more people. And certainly for women, having that option to put their children in childcare, or also to address adult care for persons who have older adults that they're caring for, such that they can go to work. So certainly this would help with labor shortages as well as bolster household incomes and potentially also consumption.
Dana, what happens to payrolls growth in this country if you take away taxes on overtime?
Well, I think it certainly could help bolster payrolls when you have certainly, again, labor shortages, especially in places where you have to physically show up to work, like restaurants, where you're most likely to receive overtime or even tips. So you could see some improvement in labor market activity, but I think it's more going to be on the income side, where people will see boosts in their income and consequently have more space to consume.
Obviously, we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves and looking at the potential policy of the next president, who still has an election to win in November. I know we talked about what kind of economy they will inherit in January, but there's also the question of how people will be feeling about the economy when they go to cast their ballot. We've been talking a lot about vibes, Dana, and consumer sentiment from the Conference Board or even University of Michigan is kind of a vibe check in some way. How do the vibes feel to you right now?
Well, it's interesting. Consumers are saying they're a little bit more concerned about the equity market, certainly after the episode we had in August. They're also more concerned about the labor market and job prospects going forward, and they're still complaining about prices being elevated. Nonetheless, they continue to spend. When we look at the data, certainly for retail sales and PCE in July, consumers spent about 3% annualized in real consumption in July. And then for August, yes, retail sales were kind of weak. They were down a tick in real terms. But still, when you fold up July and August, retail sales still grew by 3.3% annualized. That doesn't sound like an economy, or at least a consumer that's really concerned. And indeed, when we ask consumers point blank, do you believe a recession is coming? Most are saying, no, we don't. So I think it's really going to be about how much consumers want to repair their balance sheets after accumulating debt, and if they remain employed. And again, we think that most consumers will hold on to their jobs because companies are not letting them go, and that's going to support consumption going forward.
All right, Dana Peterson, Chief Economist at the Conference Board, calling 25 basis points tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining us. And coming up, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump back on the campaign trail today. Harris speaking to reporters, as we just heard a little bit of, at the NABJ this afternoon in Philadelphia. Donald Trump getting set for a town hall in Michigan. We'll have more with our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It's a crying shame. When you have that kind of microphone in front of you, you really ought to understand at a very deep level how much your words have meaning. When you are bestowed with a microphone that is that big, there is a profound responsibility that comes with that. That is an extension of what should not be lost in this moment, this concept of the public trust. To then understand what the public trust means. It means that you have been invested with trust to be responsible.
Kamala Harris earlier today being interviewed by the National Association of Black Journalists, the NABJ, discussing Donald Trump and J.D. Vance's comments about Springfield, Ohio, where now the state police have been called in to make people feel safe. Joining us now, our political panel. Kristen Hahn is back, Rock Solutions partner and Democratic strategist, alongside Lester Munson, the co-head of international practice at BGR Group, Republican strategist. Great to see both of you, and welcome back. Longest tweet I've ever seen in my life came late last evening from J.D. Vance. I haven't counted the words yet, but this could be the beginning of a new book, in which he says Kamala Harris has said democracy is on the line in her race against President Trump. The gunman agreed and used the exact same phrase, Kristen. He's calling out Democrats and the media for rhetoric that he says has led to this violence on the campaign trail and a second attempted assassination of Donald Trump, who has also called Kamala Harris a fascist who would bring the end of this nation. How do these balance each other out?
I don't think it needs to be a race to the bottom. However, I have seen, J.D. Vance and Donald Trump and all the surrogates all over television today making this comment that the Democrats are using all this very dangerous rhetoric, which I think is pretty rich. I mean, you can't talk about it without talking about January 6th in the context of this. I do think that without laying the fault at the vice president's feet, because I think she's been very measured in how she speaks, and she was just saying, this at NABJ, that, we could all take a step back, and I know it's an important election. I believe it's an important election, and people on all sides can kind of tamper their language down a little bit.
So as we consider the likelihood that will happen, Lester, when we see the language from both J.D. Vance and Donald Trump, does it feel to you like rhetoric that's getting ready to be toned down, or just continually get hotter as we get closer to Election Day?
I agree with Kristen. I think it's time for everyone to take a deep breath, take a step back. Everyone should be using more moderate rhetoric. I think both parties are pursuing a get-out-the-base strategy, so they need to inflame their voters or cause fear in their voters or cause some sort of emotion in their voters to get them out. So part of this is the political strategy that's involved in the campaign. And I think there's not a lack of logic here, but I think people need to use their better angels and kind of take a different approach here, because there are real-world consequences when the rhetoric gets too hot.
Well, we've had 33, I believe, is the latest count, bomb threats in Springfield, Ohio. As I mentioned, a big number of state police have been sent to the city from the governor. Donald Trump says he's planning to visit. Would it be a good time to change that plan?
He's not afraid to go in front of a potential hostile audience. We saw Kamala Harris go talk to the black journalists today. He did that a month ago. Arguably a difficult thing for him to do. He didn't really do too well at it. But he's willing to go to places and deliver tough messages. I think when he does that, he has to bring responsible rhetoric with him. The vice president actually was pretty close to being eloquent on that issue, I thought, today.
Well, before he makes a trip to Springfield, we know he will be in Flint, Michigan tonight in a town hall being moderated by Sarah Huckabee Sanders. And then he's heading to Long Island. Kristen, perhaps an interesting choice. He said, according to his post on True Social, part of what he'll talk about there is SALT. The cap that went into place on the state and local tax deduction when he was president with his 2017 tax cuts, he's going to make go away. This is a gift for Democrats in blue states like New York and California, right?
They've been fighting for it a long time. You look at people like Josh Gottheimer in the House. They've been talking about the New York Democrats.
Yeah.
But I think you never know where Trump's going to be. This is why I don't understand how the markets are always just so excited. Seems to be excited when he's up in the polls. Because they think he's going to be so great for business. But he's very unpredictable. So, you never know. And he just kind of goes where the winds blow him sometimes. But this one was interesting to me, for sure.
Well, it absolutely is. Are we going to re-propose the 2017 tax cuts with other changes? Or is this Donald Trump riffing on a Tuesday afternoon?
When is he not riffing?
Okay.
He's totally transactional. If he thinks it's going to be good for him to oppose his own tax deal from 7 years ago, I'm sure he will do that, and we would not be surprised.
Well, of course, it's not just that he's been up to these days. Last night, he spent a great deal of time on X Spaces, again, talking about a new crypto venture that his sons are involved in, World Liberty Financial. And he talks more specifically about why he thinks crypto is so critical to develop here in the U.S. Here's what he said.
My attitude is different. If we don't do it, China's going to do it. China's doing it anyway.
They are.
But if we don't do it, we're not going to be the biggest, and we have to be the biggest and the best.
So maybe that speaks to the kind of policy he would adopt or the kind of regulators he would put into place if he were president. Again, he might be more friendly to the industry, Lester. But the conflict of interest question with World Liberty Financial is raised here. If he becomes president again and his sons are involved in this, does that not create problems?
Well, I think his position, as I understand it, in that company is effectively as a spokesperson. He doesn't really own the company. He's not creating the product. He's a spokesperson for it. Presumably that ends if he becomes president. But I guess becomes president again. But we'll see, I guess.
Well, it brings us back to questions that campaign practitioners are asking, and maybe even you two, a DNR, might talk about over a beer after work. Why are we golfing with 50 days left? Why are we at the Coliseum on Long Island with 45 days left, whatever it will be tomorrow? Why are we launching new crypto businesses? Does any of this help elect Donald Trump?
I think running for office is a business venture for him. He's done press conferences in front of his products before, his steaks, his shoes, all the different things that he's doing. I'm not sure, I think being president could be one goal of his, but the other goal is to use this just to his advantage as he's looking to launch these different ventures. We know that he's got his struggles on the money side of things, both on the political side with his campaign and personally with his finances. So he's probably looking at all these different avenues to figure out how he can make money.
All right, Kristen and Lester will be sticking with us because coming up, we also have to talk about the Speaker of the House next move. He's trying to avoid a government shutdown, and there's a big vote on that tomorrow. We'll have more next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
People need to get home. People need to campaign. This election could not be more critical right now, certainly at the presidential level. And I think the Senate, we've got a tremendous opportunity before us to change the gavel. It's going to have, require a lot of work and taking nothing for granted. We'd certainly like to get home and do that, but we need to get this done right.
That was Republican Senator Bill Hagerty of Tennessee earlier this hour talking about averting a government shutdown, which could start just 2 weeks from now. Back with us, our political panel, Kristen Hahn and Lester Munson. So, of course, the efforts are underway on Capitol Hill to make sure that shutdown doesn't happen just before an election. Mike Johnson had a plan, and he seems to be sticking to it, a 6-month continuing resolution with the SAVE Act attached, making illegal something that already is illegal, non-citizens voting in U.S. elections, knowing, Lester, even if he can get it through the House, which is an if at this point, it's going nowhere in the Senate. So what is the point of the exercise?
Well, I think it's, get a little exercise. Let's show the base he can do the things that they want him to do. Give him the vote. It's going to fail. We've seen this movie before. The Senate will come up with a compromise that will involve members of both parties. And then the House is going to have to pass that and take a tough vote on it. It probably means Johnson will need Democratic votes coming over to pass it through the House and keep the government open. I don't think Republicans want to close the government right before the election where it could have significant impact on the presidential race, the Senate race, and the House race.
You don't mind a couple extra laps? I'm sure here, Republicans say that this is not, in fact, the SAVE Act that has been a poison pill for Democrats, that this is not a solution in search of a problem, that it actually would bring additional enforcement measures to illegals voting in American elections. Is there any truth to that? Why do Democrats have such an allergy to this idea?
I don't think so at all, because you are creating, you're telegraphing to the American public that this boogeyman, that is, we have unsafe elections, insecure elections. That's not really a problem. And so you don't want to telegraph to the whole country that you're solving this problem, which is what Republicans want to be saying. So I don't know. And then, on the funding piece of this, we know how this is going to go. Fine, take a couple show votes. But
this
I think
doesn't prevent something from passing.
No, and it's never going to pass. They're going to do a shorter term CR to get, make sure the government's funded, you would hope. A government shutdown in an election year, like Lester said, is just, terrible for the party in charge. So.
We should point out the SAVE Act, when it passed the House initially, did get 5 Democratic votes from Democrats that are in more vulnerable swing districts. I guess perhaps none of them will be voting for this attached to a CR this time around. But to Kristen's suggestion on this is basically giving the idea to the American people that something needs to be done to make elections safe. Is this not just laying the groundwork for raising questions around election integrity if you don't like the outcome?
Of course it is. And by the way, the other party does this as well. Democrats like to talk about vote suppression. They like to make a big campaign about allegations about certain things that are beneficial to their constituents. The Republicans like to do what we're seeing here, where they kind of call into question the security of the vote. This is a technique by both parties. They're both jockeying for position, both trying to get out those little extra votes because they're concerned about the process or that kind of thing. I think we should see it for what it is. This is a lot of politics. There's a lot of messaging to the base, and both parties do it because we are so closely divided. This is a 50-50 election.
Well, that's just a remarkable and honest answer. Where are we then? Apology accepted. Where are we a week after the election with all of that said? If parties are going out of their way to create an infrastructure to challenge the results, what's November going to be like?
I don't think this is anything new. Campaigns hire lawyers. Kristen knows this as well as I do. Campaigns hire lawyers to monitor what happens on the day of the vote.
We're in the post-20 world now, though.
There's always that moment after the polls close when you do the analysis of what do we know, what happened, that kind of thing. It almost always gets settled out afterwards, and we come to an agreement on what happened. Yes, there have been some incidents where it's been hard to tell. The 2000 vote in Florida is I think, the very big example. But I have faith the American people do the right thing.
We just have 30 seconds left, Kristen, but doesn't this entire conversation need to change after January 6th?
This entire conversation needs to change now. I mean, I agree with part of what Lester said, but, there are two big differences between the major candidates on the ticket is that one has gone out of her way to say, we will accept the outcome of the election, no matter what that is. And we have Donald Trump, who clearly has said that he will not. and is setting the stage to claim election interference. So I think there's a bit of a difference there.
Will we know the weekend after who won the election?
Hopefully.
Lester, you think?
Yes.
Wow, I love the optimism from our great panel. Kristen Hahn and Lester Munson. What a great conversation. Thank you both for being with us. And check out the Washington Edition newsletter. You've got a lot to catch up on today. It's on the terminal and online.
And we'll see you back tomorrow for Fed Day. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio.